The air in the room was already thick with tension. Two men stood facing each other, one a legend in motion, the other a challenger convinced he had cracked the code. Bruce Lee, whose hands moved faster than most eyes could follow, watched his opponent with calm curiosity. The other man, confident and prepared, believed he had studied every angle, every weakness. He thought he could outthink the dragon. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Bruce Lee shifted his weight by an inch. Just an inch. And in that microsecond, the fight was already over. The only man who tried to outsmart Bruce Lee failed. Instantly, Bruce Lee's counterintuitive trapping hand principle dismantled logical attack patterns before they could fully form. Unlike traditional martial artists who relied on blocking or evading then countering, Lee developed a direct, almost illogical approach. He would trap an opponent's limb the moment it committed to motion, not after. This wasn't brute force or speed alone, it was a redefinition of timing itself. The principle stemmed from his philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, or the way of the intercepting fist, which rejected fixed patterns in favor of flow. When a fighter throws a punch, their brain first signals intent, then the shoulder rotates, then the arm extends. Most martial artists react after the extension. Lee, however, trained to intercept at the shoulder rotation phase, using a light, adhesive trapping motion that redirected energy rather than met it head-on. In the case of the man who tried to outsmart him, the challenger had mapped out a three-step combination, a feint to the low ribs, a jab to the face, then a rear cross. He believed his pattern was unpredictable. But Lee's trapping hand didn't wait for step one. As the challenger's shoulder began its first micro-movement, Lee's left hand gently contacted the incoming wrist, not to block, but to stick and guide it off course by 2 inches, just enough to make the punch glance past his ear. Simultaneously, Lee's right hand moved to the challenger's elbow, a second trap that froze the arm mid-extension. In less than half a second, the logical attack chain was broken at its root. The challenger's brain, expecting resistance or a dodge, instead felt his own limb being led into empty space, his balance tilting forward. Lee didn't need to strike hard. The failure was already complete. The man's carefully constructed logic collapsed because Lee's hands treated the attack not as a threat but as a misplaced object to be guided aside. No martial arts manual of the era taught this. It was pure Lee, turning the opponent's momentum into disorientation, proving that pattern recognition is useless when the pattern itself is denied a landing point. The challenger later admitted he never even saw the trap coming. He just felt his arm vanish from his control as if Lee had borrowed it without asking. The challenger's over-reliance on premeditated strategy ignored Lee's signature intercepting fist response time. In most combat sports and self-defense systems, fighters are taught to read an attack, react, and then counter. That sequence, stimulus to response, typically takes a trained athlete anywhere from 0.2 to 0.3 seconds. Bruce Lee studied this biological delay obsessively and concluded that waiting for an attack to fully launch was already a mistake. His solution was the intercepting fist. Not a block, not a dodge, but a direct strike that meets the opponent's attack at the very beginning of its trajectory. To the challenger who thought he could outsmart Lee, this concept was entirely foreign. He had spent weeks preparing a strategic framework. He would circle to Lee's blind side, use a non-telegraphic front kick to occupy the center line, and then follow with an overhand right. Each step was chosen to counter what he believed were Lee's common responses. He even practiced specific reactions to Lee's famous sidekick and straight blast. But what he failed to account for was that Lee's intercepting fist doesn't wait for the opponent to finish thinking. The moment the challenger's weight shifted onto his rear foot to begin his kick, Lee's body recognized the kinetic cue, the subtle hip turn and heel lift, and launched a straight punch directly into the challenger's advancing chest. That punch arrived not after the kick but during the kick's first 3 inches of travel. The challenger's premeditated strategy collapsed because his brain was still executing step 1 while Lee's fist was already ending step 0. Intercepting works by compressing time. A normal fighter sees a punch coming, processes it, then moves. Lee's training eliminated the processing gap. He moved the instant the opponent's intent became physical, often before the opponent even realized they had fully committed. In the dojo that day, witnesses described the challenger as looking like a man who had tried to solve a math problem only to discover the numbers kept changing. He expected a chess match of counters and recounters. Instead, Lee simply refused to play the game by those rules. Every feint the challenger threw was met with a finger jab to the face before the feint could become real. Every setup step was answered by a low side kick to the shin that landed during the step, not after it. The man's strategy assumed two minds exchanging moves. Lee's intercepting fist showed that when response time approaches 0, there is no exchange, only interruption. Lee's minimalistic footwork and sudden level changes exploited the exact blind spot the challenger had failed to account for. Most martial artists, especially those trained in traditional systems, develop a predictable vertical sense of combat. They expect exchanges to happen at eye level, with punches aimed at the head or chest and kicks directed to the midsection, or legs. The challenger, a disciplined strategist, had drilled countless hours defending against high-line attacks and low-line sweeps. He had even practiced checking leg kicks and parrying hooks to the jaw. What he never anticipated was that Bruce Lee would manipulate his own height as a weapon. Lee stood at 5 feet 7 inches, not a small man but not towering. However, his footwork allowed him to seem to shrink and expand within a single breath. The principle was simple yet devastating. Lee would use a tiny shuffle step, barely 2 inches, to drop his entire torso 6 inches lower, then explode back up. To an opponent tracking Lee's head position, this sudden vertical shift created a half-second blind spot where the target seemed to vanish and reappear elsewhere. The challenger, who had planned to control distance with linear jabs and teeps, found his depth perception constantly betrayed. He threw a rear cross aimed at Lee's chin, but in the time the punch traveled, Lee had already performed a micro-level change, bending his knees just enough that the punch sailed an inch over his scalp. Before the challenger could recalibrate, Lee rose back to full height and delivered a straight punch to the throat from a completely different angle. Worse than the physical effect was the psychological one. The challenger began second-guessing every distance calculation. His pre-fight strategy relied on knowing exactly where Lee's head would be at each exchange. Lee's level changes made that knowledge useless. The blind spot was not a physical gap in peripheral vision but a cognitive one, the challenger's. Brain could not simultaneously track horizontal movement, vertical shift, and launch its own offense. Lee exploited this by combining the level change with tiny pivots, never moving more than a foot in any direction. While the challenger bounced and circled, wasting energy, Lee simply adjusted his knee bend and hip height, slipping attacks by millimeters. In the decisive moment, the challenger attempted a lunging hook punch, a move he had practiced 1,000 times. Lee dropped his level, let the hook pass cleanly over his lowered head, and then rose directly inside the challenger's guard. This man's arms were extended and high, his lower ribs were completely exposed. Lee's palm strike landed before the challenger could drop his elbows. The failure was total because the blind spot was invisible to the man who carried it.